At the start of the 1920s, Florida was, by most measures, an afterthought. According to the 1920 United States Census, the state's total population was roughly 968,000, making it one of the least populated states in the South. Much of its territory consisted of swamp, pine scrub, and mangrove. Summers were brutal, the mosquito problem was severe, and the infrastructure outside a handful of coastal towns was minimal. Henry Flagler had extended his Florida East Coast Railway to Miami by 1896 and completed the Overseas Railway to Key West in January 1912, seeding small resort communities along the Atlantic coast. But the idea that this landscape could become a destination for millions of Americans, let alone a speculative bonanza, would have struck almost any observer in 1920 as far-fetched. Three things converged to make the boom structurally possible. First, the automobile. By the early 1920s, car ownership was spreading through the American middle class, and Florida began building roads to receive the traffic. Second, post-war prosperity. The United States emerged from World War I as a creditor nation, and the 1920s brought rising wages and expanding consumer credit for many Americans. Third, a speculative mood that had found few outlets since the war. Real estate, unlike stocks, felt tangible and understandable. You could stand on a lot and imagine a house. That psychological accessibility made Florida land a natural vehicle for the decade's appetite for quick returns, and aggressive promoters were ready to exploit it. The boom was not spontaneous. It was built by promoters who understood that land sales were as much a marketing exercise as a development one. Carl Fisher, an Indianapolis businessman who had made a fortune selling Prestolite carbide headlights and helped co-found the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, bought Barrier Island land near Miami and dredged it into what became Miami Beach. He spent heavily on national advertising, importing polo ponies and celebrities to make the destination synonymous with glamour. Addison Mizner, an architect known for Mediterranean revival design, convinced wealthy backers to finance his development at Boca Raton, selling lots at remarkable prices before a single permanent building was finished. Their campaigns placed Florida in newspapers across the country and drew buyers from states that had barely registered Florida's existence a decade earlier. The financial structure of the boom amplified every movement in prices. A buyer could secure a contract on a Florida lot by putting down roughly 10%, receiving what was called a binder, which gave the holder the right to purchase the property at the agreed price. Rather than completing the purchase and paying the remaining 90%, the binder holder would sell the contract to a new buyer at a higher price, pocketing the difference and never finishing the original transaction. A class of full-time speculators emerged, commonly called binder boys, who queued outside real estate offices at dawn to secure contracts on newly listed properties and flip them before the end of the day. Because only the deposit was at risk, a modest rise in the underlying lot price produced a much larger percentage return on the amount actually committed. As long as prices kept climbing, everyone in the chain could profit. The mechanism was entirely self-reinforcing until confidence broke. By 1925, the boom had reached a pitch that contemporary observers described with difficulty. Frederick Lewis Allen, writing in his 1931 Social History Only Yesterday, documented accounts of people mortgaging their northern homes to purchase Florida lots they had never visited. Real estate transaction volumes in Miami during 1925 were reported by contemporaries as extraordinary even by national standards. And the Miami Herald became one of the country's thickest newspapers by advertising revenue as developers competed for lot listings. Trains into Florida were packed. Hotels overflowed. Subdivisions were platted and sold miles from any existing road, sewer, or school, on the promise that infrastructure would follow. Prices on some Miami Beach properties had multiplied many times over in a few years. The state could not build public works fast enough to keep pace with what promoters were promising buyers, but in the frenzy of 1925, that gap barely registered. The first visible fracture was not a financial shock. It was a logistics failure. The Florida East Coast Railway, overwhelmed by the volume of building materials, consumer goods, and migrants flowing into the state, imposed an embargo on all but perishable freight in January 1926. The railroad simply could not handle the load on its single-track main line. Construction supply chains stalled. Developers found themselves unable to finish buildings they had already sold. Contemporary accounts describe ships carrying lumber and cement waiting at anchor in Biscayne Bay for berths that did not open, and some reports mention vessels that were ultimately scuttled or abandoned in the bay, though the precise details in these accounts vary by source. The embargo lasted several months and made unmistakably clear that the physical infrastructure underpinning the boom was nowhere near adequate for the level of activity that had been promised to buyers. The decisive blow came from nature. On September 18, 1926, a powerful hurricane made landfall at Miami Beach. The United States Weather Bureau estimated winds at around 120 to 130 miles per hour at landfall. According to records compiled by the National Hurricane Center and historical accounts from the American Red Cross, the storm killed at least 372 people and left an estimated 18,000 families homeless in the Miami area. Property damage across coastal Dade and Broward counties was severe. Many of the newer subdivisions that had been marketed as resort communities turned out to occupy low-lying, flood-prone land that had been drained just enough to sell. When the storm surge receded, what remained contradicted the promotional materials in every particular. The hurricane did not merely damage property. It physically demonstrated that the premise on which much of the boom had rested was false. Florida's banking system had grown alongside the boom and contracted sharply alongside it. Banks had extended credit to developers and buyers throughout the peak years, and their loan portfolios were now secured by collateral whose value was falling rapidly. Between 1926 and 1929, Florida experienced a wave of bank failures that preceded the national banking crisis by several years. The state had no effective deposit insurance and inadequate supervision of real estate lending practices. When borrowers defaulted, banks failed, depositors lost savings, and the credit that had funded further development disappeared. Economic historians who have examined Florida's interwar banking record note that the concentration of bank failures in Florida in 1926 and 1927 was unusually high relative to the rest of the country at that time. For residents of the state, the economic contraction that the country would not experience nationally until 1929 had already arrived. The region was allowed no time to stabilize. In September 1928, a second major hurricane crossed the Florida peninsula and struck Lake Okeechobee in the interior of the state. The storm surge from the lake breached the earthen dike along its southern shore, flooding low-lying agricultural communities in the Glades region. The National Hurricane Center estimates that the Okeechobee hurricane killed at least 2,500 people, and some historical accounts place the figure considerably higher. It remains among the deadliest weather events in American history. For Florida's already damaged economy, the storm destroyed additional property, pushed more loans into default, and accelerated further bank failures. By the time the national stock market collapsed in October 1929, Florida was already several years into its own economic depression. Some financial historians who have studied the 1920s credit cycle note that the Florida collapse illustrates how speculative excess can concentrate and implode in one sector without immediately causing national contagion, provided the losses are absorbed locally. The Florida boom was large in human terms, but not large enough in absolute dollar amounts to directly cause the 1929 stock market crash, and the scholarly consensus treats any direct causal link between the two as unproven. However, the structural mechanics were a precise preview: easy credit, leveraged contracts, an asset whose price rested on buyer confidence rather than underlying income, and a collapse that left lenders holding collateral worth far less than the loans against it. Some historians have also suggested, though this remains contested rather than established, that the Florida failure may have influenced lending norms in parts of the banking system in 1927 and 1928 as losses became visible. But this connection requires further archival research before it can be stated as more than a hypothesis. The boom left several institutional marks. Florida tightened its real estate licensing requirements in the aftermath as the legislature recognized that unregulated land sales had permitted widespread misrepresentation. The binder system had allowed buyers to purchase lots they never visited based on promotional maps that, in many cases, showed improvements that did not exist and omitted flood risks that were significant. At the federal level, the collapse contributed to a broader set of discussions about mortgage underwriting standards that accumulated through the late 1920s and the early Depression years. The Federal Housing Administration, created in 1934, introduced standardized underwriting criteria for residential mortgages that addressed in formal terms some of the lending practices that had made the Florida boom so fragile, though by 1934 the specific memory of Florida had been overshadowed by the national catastrophe that followed it. The Florida land boom of the 1920s established a template that has reappeared in American real estate with notable regularity. The core ingredients recur: low down payment requirements that create leverage without accountability, promotional marketing that substitutes excitement for due diligence, infrastructure that cannot keep pace with sales promises, and an asset whose price depends entirely on the next buyer paying more than the current one did. Because leverage amplifies both gains and losses, these cycles tend to end not gradually but suddenly. And the credit losses embedded in bank portfolios tend to outlast the boom by years. Knowing what the internal dynamics of a credit-fueled property boom look like from the inside is not a method for predicting future cycles. Markets are shaped by too many variables for that kind of mechanical forecasting. But the structural literacy that comes from tracing the 1925 peak to the 1926 collapse helps you ask more precise questions the next time a promotional campaign tells you that a particular piece of land is the opportunity of a generation.